All right, well, let's begin. Welcome to all. We got 215 people online. Welcome to our first live stream. My name is Scott Elness. I'm the video producer with MBT, and I will be sort of the master of ceremonies for this wonderful event. To me, she's over here. That's Vanessa. Vanessa is sort of the can do everything person for MBT, also the leader of Low Entropy Community on Facebook. If you're not a member, you should be, because all the cool kids are. And of course, Tom, everybody knows Tom. We'll kind of skip most of his address. Well, some people may not know Tom, former NASA physicist, and also one of the early leaders in consciousness studies. And we'll be learning a lot more about him. And, you know, I got to be honest, I got a bio here of John, but I really think John will do a much better job of introducing himself. So, John, I'm going to invite you to not only introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you've got going on, but you get the honor of tossing out the first question. So, and before I forget, audience members, chime in. Vanessa will be sort of interfacing with y'all, looking for new questions, and we'll do it for the next hour. So, John, take it away.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here with you guys today. I'm John G. Kruth, and I'm the Executive Director of the Rhine Research Center and the Education Director of the Rhine Education Center. Some people don't know what the Rhine Research Center is. The Rhine Research Center is the oldest parapsychology lab in the United States. It's been operating since 1935 when it started at Duke University. And about 1965, we moved off campus and became a nonprofit organization. We study parapsychology. A lot of people, when they think about parapsychology, they think about things like Bigfoot or aliens or Loch Ness Monster. Those are interesting things, but that's not what we study. We actually study 5 very specific things. We study mind-to-mind communication, telepathy. We study clairvoyance, getting information about objects or events from a distance. We study precognition, getting information through time. These 3 things, telepathy, mind-mind communication, clairvoyance, and precognition, make up what we call ESP, or extrasensory perception. J.B. Rhine made this term very popular back in the 1930s, and it's in our normal nomenclature now. Besides ESP, we also study something called PK, psychokinesis. Many people call it telekinesis, but it's mind-matter interaction. Those 4 things, ESP, all the ESP phenomena and PK together, make up what we call psi. So you might hear me use the term psi over and over. That just is, it doesn't have any specific meaning. It is a cover term for all of those phenomena. The 5th area we study is survival studies, and survival studies includes anything that indicates that there might be a persistence of personality, character, soul, spirit outside of the physical form. And things like reincarnation, near-death experience, out-of-body experience, mediumship, communication with spirits, and also apparitions and hauntings. These are all phenomena we look into at the Rhine. Right now, we have quite a number of research projects going on. Everything from remote viewing, people who are trying to see things that might be going on in the future or perceive objects from a distance, to my background was in computer science, so some of the work we're doing is trying to bring some of the older studies that have been done in parapsychology into the 21st century and digitizing them and making them available to more people. Doing some research on healing. Also, one of the major research projects that I'm doing right now is looking at the energies that people always talk about when they talk about healing energies, or when they talk about the energy of psychokinesis or mind-matter interaction. I'm able to measure things in what we call the bioenergy lab at the Rhine, where we're looking at biophotons. We're actually looking at light as a potential source of the energy. We can go into that in a lot more detail, but I'm going to turn this back to Scott.
Well, would you like to dish up Tom the first question and get us off and rolling?
Oh, sure. Tom, it's really nice to meet you. I hadn't met you before, but I've read a lot about your work and I've heard about it. And, one of the questions that I always wonder about when I meet people who are in this field and studying these types of topics. I wonder where they got their start in the field, what really attracted them to it. You know, I know back in the early 70s when I was in school, some of Bell's theorems were really just hitting the public, and they were starting to realize that there was some really weird things going on in the world that wasn't easy to explain. When I learned about this in school, that's when I started to think, wow, if these weird things are happening, maybe there's a way for us to actually manipulate them and change them a little bit. So that's kind of where I started to get an inkling of an interest in this. I was wondering where your interests came from and where they originated.
Well, I started with Transcendental Meditation, taking a course. It cost me $25 and a banana back in the probably late 60s, maybe 69, something like that. And I did that for only one reason, and that's because the little flyer that I was reading said that I would need less sleep. I was a graduate student then, working on my PhD, and getting along with less sleep would have been a real bonus for me. I was working at low energy nuclear physics, and you have big machines that you get running, and once those things run and all the electronics works, you just have to keep at it, and until the experiment's over, and sometimes that takes days. So you may be able to, you may have to work that thing for 2 or 3 days with nothing more than an hour here, an hour there, catnap to get through it, and then help from some of your friends. So anyway, that's why I started TM. And then I found out about 3 months later that I could debug software with my mind that I couldn't do actually as well looking at looking at the printouts. I could close my eyes, get in a meditation state, and bring up a picture of the printout and scroll through it, and all the lines that had bugs in them were red. And I could just look at the red lines and I'd say, okay, there's one. I see that error. And I did the next one. And then I'd go actually get my box of cards. Back in the bad old days when, computers worked on boxes of punch cards, I'd get the box of cards and look at those lines. And sure enough, it was accurate. Those were the mistakes. And in those days, debugging your code was a very important thing. Not like today, you just cut and try. In those days, that, you spent weeks, months trying to get the bugs out, because you may only get one run a week on the computer, because the whole university was using one computer that now is probably only half as strong as what's in your cell phone. And in any case, that was my big aha moment, like you talk about, like, wow, this tells me that my previous viewpoint, which was a standard physics viewpoint of if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist or it isn't important. And suddenly I had something that was totally immeasurable. The effects were measurable, but the process, creating those effects was not measurable. So I knew reality was a lot bigger than I thought it was. And I'm a physicist, and what we do is model reality. So, there you go. And then I got out of graduate school, got a job, and within probably 6 months of that job, I had connected with Bob Monroe. And I was, Bob had just built a lab. And when Bob built it, he didn't really know what he was going to do with it. It was build it and they will come kind of a thing. Well, they built it and I came. So I was there, and he was looking for some scientists to work in his lab. And I volunteered with the idea that I'd be a, free scientific help if he would teach me to do what he could do in the outer body, which he did. And then I learned how to go out of body and explore the larger conscious system on demand whenever I wanted to. And I could do it steadily and precisely enough that I could get the exact same state, go to the exact same places, and we put places in quotes here because there really are no places, and repeat things. So then I could start doing experiments there, change a variable, do it again, do it 100 times, then change another variable and do it again. And eventually I thought I found enough about what you could do, what you couldn't do, what the constraints were, that I ought to sit down and write it down, because writing it forces clarity. As long as you have it in your mind but don't write it down, it's fuzzy. Once you have to write it down, it has to be logical. So I wrote it down, and that was the beginning of these books, the My Big Toe trilogy that I published in 2003. So that's kind of how I got into it. And while I was with Bob, there were lots of aha moments there that let me know that it was real, because I was a young physicist, and I wasn't going to go down la la lane just because somebody wanted to lead me there. I was a hard case, and another friend of mine worked together. We both kind of met Bob at the same time. He was a double E. And we agreed that if this didn't turn out to be something real, we'd just kind of slip out the back, but it did turn out to be something real. And we both got a lot out of it. And we had probably been a couple of years, maybe 3 years, and I was spending 15, 20 hours a week with Bob Monroe. So it was like a second job, pretty much. And at that time, we had lots and lots of data, healing, remote viewing, all the paranormal things you mentioned. We practiced those things just to get evidence that what we were doing was real, to convince ourselves. And we had mountains of evidence. We had, it was, 100,000 to 1 that we were just able to do the things we were able to do just by good luck and guessing right. So we knew that intellectually that it was real, but knowing it intellectually and knowing it at a deep fundamental level in your gut are two different things entirely. And Dennis and I did an out of body together, where we went out of body together, stayed together, talked with each other while we were out of body, had conversations, pointed out things, discussed what we saw. And all of this was being taped with 2 separate cassette tapes, with a mic at my mouth and one at Dennis's. And we were acoustically isolated from each other. So we couldn't hear, we weren't connected. Actually, we were electromagnetically isolated as well, in separate booths, in separate parts of the lab. There's an empty booth between us. So when we got out of that, Bob flipped both of the tapes so they would run at the same time. And there was Dennis and I having conversations, answering each other's questions, talking about the same things. Well, my jaw dropped down to the ground. And that was my big moment of, I got it now. I no longer have to prove it to myself that it's real. Even though I had tons of evidence, that's intellectual. That isn't the same as having something that is kind of a personal moment. I mean, we had lots of weird stuff happen to Dennis and I, but it was so weird out at Bob's that, it stopped being weird. Weird things were just normal. We went out there, and every day we did stuff that was totally off the wall. But this was the thing that made me realize that I didn't have to ask the question, is it real, anymore? And once you let that go, it's a lot easier, actually, to learn more. That resistance to the is it real, it actually turns out to be a block, makes it harder for you to experience. So that's kind of how I got into it. And then I spent like 35 years doing research in my own mind and consciousness, in the larger consciousness system, before I thought I understood it well enough to write it down. And then I spent another 5 years writing it down. And during that writing it down, I learned a lot. That was very informative, because I'd come to little holes in my theory, holes in my experience, and then I have to go do some experiments to fill up those holes. So that took a while. So that's kind of where I come from. And what I wrote in my books was a theory of consciousness. And that was, I knew consciousness was fundamental, and the physical world was a derivative thereof. I had learned that. That was a fact in my mind. I had lots of facts in my mind that I guess most other people didn't have in their mind, because I'd spent so much time in the non-physical. So I had accumulated all these facts, and that was one of them. Consciousness is fundamental. Everything's derived from that. But I didn't actually get the physics connection until about 2 or 3 years after the books were published. And then I realized that the same principles, the same ideas that I had in my theory of consciousness and reality also would answer the big outstanding mysteries in physics. I looked at it, I knew why, light speed was a constant. That was obvious. I knew why the double slit experiment worked the way it did. It wasn't mysterious or even weird science. It made perfectly good logical sense. So that's when I started, doing more about the physics, adding that part to it. So that's pretty recent. And then just a couple of years ago, I came up with a set of experiments, which is why we're doing this big kickstart. To get those experiments done, they will give a lot of evidence to the fact that this is a virtual reality and that consciousness is the computer. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of my story of how a nice physicist like me got to a place like this.
Well, it's interesting to me that you talk about having this out-of-body experience, and now you're having a conversation. One of the things that really convinced me that I didn't have to really question myself anymore was having a shared dream with someone where we both discussed the same issues independently of each other, and we compared notes, and we had the same shared experience during a dream. So the shared consciousness is something that really, it provided me the comfort level that I could then start asking, now that I know this, how can I start talking to other people about it? And this is where I started to think, well, maybe the language of science would work. And it seems that this project is exactly addressing this issue. How can we speak the language that scientists and statisticians can understand, physicists can understand, to help them understand these experiences that we have?
Yeah, I echoed, I'm a meteorologist and a theologian, and I think that this, to me, sort of answers, on both ends of the spectrum. Before I forget, one of the things I was noticing, some people were having audio issues. They say that Chrome is the best browser, and we're not sponsored by Chrome, just so that you know. That's a free announcement. Also, last time I checked, I think we made like $66,000 in one day, if anybody didn't look. That's like 44% funded in one day. So now we've got 28 days to finish. So if you haven't chimed in and contributed, go and do that now. That would be awesome if we could get it done earlier and get this thing rolling. Vanessa, I assume you've probably seen some questions out there you want to throw one at us here.
Yeah, so around the experiments, Chase had a question asking, how long will the experiments take from start to finish with all the results?
I missed some of that, Vanessa. The audio kind of warbled there in the middle of your question.
Oh, basically Chase was just asking, how long will the experiments take to conduct?
Well, these experiments have not ever been done before, so it's a little chancy to predict exactly how long they're going to take. When you're doing experiments, they seem real easy when it's just in your head, and you can see how it's done. But then where the time gets used up is in trying to get the equipment to work and work right, and not have noise, and not pick up vibrations from the outside world, and this sort of thing. So there's lots of issues that come up with actually doing the experiment itself that takes time. You have to get the right equipment. Sometimes you buy equipment, you think it's right, but it doesn't quite work, and then you have to get more, and all of that takes time. So I don't know exactly, but if we get enough funding, the funding that we have as a minimum, that $150,000, that is a bare minimum for us to do a few experiments and make a little documentary about doing it. If we get more than that, we'll be able to do more experiments. And to get probably to do all the experiments, it's going to cost more in the $300,000 or so, like double that. I'd say, to get all the experiments done. But once we get a few done, that will encourage people to take us more seriously, if they work. So that's part of it. So I don't know, but I'm hoping that if we get sufficient funds to do them all, we'll be able to do them all in less than a year. Probably the quickest would be about 6 months. It just takes time. I mean, it's going to take a month or so just to get the equipment together and start putting it together and finding a good place. We have some lab space now that we can use. We're not sure exactly where we're going to do the experiments yet or who's going to do them. That will take some time. So if you add all these things together, if we get it all done within 6 months or a year, I think that'd be about as much as anybody could hope for. there are about 17 experiments. That's a lot of physics experiments. Even though if you get the equipment and get them going, some of them will kind of be easier then. You know, the first setup, maybe before we get the first one done, may take us, 4 or 5 months. But after that, they ought to come along a lot quicker. So it's not going to be long, though. It's not like, a decade from now we'll have the answers. It's not that sort of thing. You know, this is short term. I very purposely made these experiments such that they were, as experiments go, easy and cheap. But that doesn't actually mean they're easy or cheap, either one. Just as experiments go, you know, physicists typically do experiments in teams of 4 or 5 or 6 people, sometimes more. When you read a physics paper that's experimental, there's usually at least 5 names at the top of the paper. And these come from multiple institutions. And those institutions pool resources. And they work on this research project for 2 or 3 years, you know, before they get a publication. That's kind of the typical physics experiment. It takes, 2 or 3 years, and it costs a lot of money, and there's a lot of people involved. Well, when I say that ours are simple and easy, I mean relative to that. I think we can probably do it all in a year for probably, $300,000 or so. So so we'll see how much money we get, how quickly we can work on it, whether we get the equipment together, find the right people, and finding the right people is going to be key. We really need some smart people who have a lot of prior experience in setting up this quantum optics kind of experiments. They're familiar with the equipment. Otherwise, we could spend 6 months just coming up on the learning curve, trying to figure out how to make all the equipment work together. So somebody who really knows what they're doing is already smart about that. They can put it all together maybe in a month instead of 6 months it'll take us if we're doing it for the first time. So it just depends if we find the right people, find the right space, and if we can afford it. But it's not a big, impossible thing. Sometimes in physics, there'll be an experiment, but there's really no way to actually implement the experiment just yet. Like some of the ones that Walker came up with. Well, he did some of those. Walker, is that right? Did I get the right word?
Wheeler?
Wheeler, yeah, the ones that Wheeler did. He just had one that was finally executed in Australia just a year or so ago. And Wheeler came up with that experiment 25 years ago. You see, so it took 25 years before the equipment came available to actually do the experiment. And that's not that unusual in physics, that people come up with experiments, but they're not really doable very quickly. They're hugely expensive, and we have to spend a few decades creating better tools before we can do them. Well, these experiments aren't like that. So for those of you that may be worried, well, is this going to be a decade? How long is this going to take? Can you do it? No, they're really cheap and easy as these things go, which means if everything works right, a year or less, we ought to be able to get it done.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, if you are watching and you want to geek out a little bit on the experiments, on the YouTube channel, there's actually some really good videos. There's one long one where Tom goes into the whole explanation, and then they're broken down into various experiments. So if you're like me and you like to geek out on the details, definitely want to go check that out. Vanessa, how about another question from the peanut gallery?
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry, just with those videos, it's the MBTLA that he really breaks them down, the MBTLA. So Liam had a question around the funding and the money that we're raising. He's just asking, will we be fully transparent with the money, show invoices and receipts, or are you just going to go and buy a house with the money?
We will be just as transparent as we can be. I guess there's various grades of transparent. Maybe if we hired 2 or 3 accountants, we could be really super transparent. So it depends on how much trouble it is, but we will spend that money on getting these experiments done, getting videos about the experiments. And if we should be so lucky as to have anything left over when we do this, it's going to go into this nonprofit corporation, which is a corporation that I've started basically to further MBT, to do research, to make an archive where all things MBT get collected together, all the videos, all the talks, everything that's out there, all the discussions, and just to make an archive of all of this so that people can do their research and can come in and look at it and would preserve it. So that's where any extra money will go. But none of it is going to go into the pockets of the people participating. We'll guarantee you that. It's all going into doing these experiments and trying to further the work that we're about here, which is, I guess, it comes in a couple of layers. One layer is to change science, have science open their minds to something bigger than just what you can measure. And secondly is to change ourselves, because we understand who we are and why we're here. And thirdly, if we change ourselves, that'll change the world. So that's really the place that we're going, is trying to make this world a kinder, gentler, more productive, cooperative place to live. That's the end point. And all of that money is going to go to furthering those goals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then Dina is asking, if these experiments work, according to your prediction, will it definitely prove that this is a virtual reality?
Well, in science, we don't really talk about proof anymore. Dean Radin is very famous for saying, proof is about whiskey. Well, proof is a little more than about whiskey. It's also about mathematics, and it's about logic. And it's about mathematics because mathematics is nothing other than the logic of quantity. That's all mathematics is. So there are proofs there, but in science, we talk about evidence, not proof. And the reason we do that is because there's a lot of time left for this planet to still exist, and who knows what kind of information we may get in the future. So physicists stopped talking about physical laws and proof probably in the early 1900s, when quantum mechanics totally destroyed all the laws that were existing at that time in physics. And then we realized that, making a law is kind of arrogant in the sense that you think you know everything and there will never be anything else in the history of the world to contradict that. Well, we don't do that in physics. So we have theories and we gather evidence. Well, I think these experiments of mine, if they work out the way I hope, they will produce very, very strong evidence that this is indeed a virtual reality, and they will produce strong evidence that consciousness is the computer, because there is really going to be no other rational explanation for them working the way they do. I'm going to do some things that are absolutely impossible. I'm going to perform a couple of miracles with these experiments if they work out the way I want. They'll do things that are not just weird, like the double slit, where these particles put themselves in a diffraction pattern for no apparent reason. We're going to do things that are physically impossible. We're going to be able to predict how a radioactive nucleus is going to decay, what direction that particle is going to go in before it decays. We're going to predict whether a photon reflects or transmits at a beam splitter. And these are physical things, not just patterns and mathematical things, but physical things that will be doing things that are just impossible. And if we do that, that's pretty strong evidence that this is not a physical-based reality, that this is a computed reality. And it's also going to be, because of the way we change some of these experiments, and the way the experiment works changes with the logic in the experiment. And you can see that the larger conscious system has to adapt to what it is we're doing and try to maintain the consistency for our reality that it's trying to maintain. And that will make it a very strong evidence that consciousness is the computer, and there's no other logical explanation.
Tom, could you expand
where the
on
computer
that?
is?
Could you expand on that a little bit? Because I think that's a crucial point, that that we have the Elon Musks and stuff like that out in the world that are talking more from a materialistic based virtual reality, whereas yours is very different in that it's consciousness based, and maybe some people don't quite understand the difference between that.
Yes. Well, I did put out a little video a couple of months ago that talked to this subject. It's about a 15 or 20 minute video. I have a hard time answering any question in less than about 15 or 20 minutes. It's just my nature. I can't help that. I don't do sound bites very well. anyway, yes, most people, when they talk about virtual reality, they've taken a half step in the right direction. And that's because the experiments in physics show that this can't be a materialistic based universe. Materialism just won't answer, the experiments. Just the double slit experiment says things. Things happen there with these particles lining up in diffraction patterns when there is no force to make them do that you cannot have a materialistic explanation for that. So we know that materialism isn't what's at the base of this reality, but scientists still cling to it anyway. It's like instead of saying, well, our theories just don't pan out with this experiment, they say instead, gee, that's a weird experiment. Well, let's go on. And they've settled into the idea that quantum mechanics is just weird. And, can quote Richard Feynman, we will probably never know how and why these experiments work. It's just impossible to know. So instead of seeing that they have failed to find a perspective and a way to understand the results of their experiments, they go on with materialism and call their experiments weird and figure that that's a good explanation. Well, that's not a good explanation at all. So we have the same thing in virtual reality. People cling to materialism, even when the facts are someplace else. So enough people are now convinced not just through quantum mechanics, but there's a lot of other things that also show us that this is a computed reality. But they cling to materialism. So what they do is they say, well, if this is a computed reality and reality is really information-based, then, well, how do we make that physical? How do we make it physical? And they say, well, okay, it's that our predecessor, the people in the future, humans in the future are nostalgic. So they have created this virtual reality of the past, and that's this virtual reality that we play in. We're their ancestors, and they are making this virtual reality, and they're playing their past. And they say, well, look at the virtual reality games we play. They're all cast in the past. People run around with swords. People run around with, ride horses and do all the things that they did in the past. And that's what they're doing. Well, that just doesn't make any sense at all. There's 3 or 4 reasons why that is just illogical. Makes no sense. But it helps them preserve their feeling that this is a physical world. It's still a physical world, and we are a virtual reality because some physical beings in our future are doing this. So there's a physical computer and physical beings, and they're all playing this, and that's why this is a computed reality. That's just materialism that won't give up is what that is. It's irrational. One reason it's irrational, okay, the way virtual reality works, the way any virtual reality works, is that you have avatars and you have players. Okay, the avatar is the actual character in the virtual reality, and in our virtual reality, that's us, that's our bodies. Okay, now who's the player? Well, the player, I say, is consciousness. Our consciousness is the player. Consciousness makes all the choices. That avatar just stands there and doesn't do anything until consciousness says, jump, run, do this, do that, go build a house, whatever. Consciousness has to make all the choices. That's the choice maker. All right, now let's see about our ancestors. Here we are in a game that is 24/7, right? We're avatars, and we exist all the time. We hardly ever just stop and wobble in place until our player comes back from lunch and starts up again. That just doesn't happen. You don't walk around and see half the people that you meet are just standing there kind of wobbling in place, waiting for their player to come back from lunch, or, after he goes to the bathroom, he comes back and starts playing again, or puts you on pause. Well, that's what happens in virtual reality games. So these future humans would have to be totally immersed, really, and do almost nothing else except play these characters. They couldn't take breaks. They can't, go eat, because characters don't pause even for a moment. Your elf, every probably every 10 or 20 minutes just stands there and wobbles for a minute or even 10 seconds or 30 seconds until you decide what to do next. It just stands there and wobbles. So an awful lot of your time playing World of Warcraft, your character's just standing around waiting for you to decide what to do next. We don't have that here. Our life is continuous. Our life moves smoothly. We don't have these moments where players go do something. But if they're physical players, just like us, living in the same universe, just in the future, well, they're going to have to pee and poop and eat and do all the things that we do. And if they do, we'd find discontinuities here. We wouldn't find continuous players, you see. Now, the other thing is, well, somehow they've managed to make us, the avatars, conscious. Well, that's irrational because the avatars are just computed things. An avatar is no more able to be conscious than your Word document is able to be conscious. It's just a bunch of ones and zeros on a hard drive someplace. Yes, it's a dynamic simulation. Those ones and zeros are always changing because time goes on and things get computed, how they change in time. But it's just ones and zeros on a hard drive. Ones and zeros on a hard drive can't be conscious. You can't make an avatar conscious. The consciousness has to exist in some other reality frame other than the virtual reality. Just like the computer that computes the virtual reality has to exist in some other reality frame other than the virtual reality. So that elf in the World of Warcraft, he can't go find the computer that's computing his virtual reality inside the World of Warcraft. It has to be non-physical to the elf in some other reality frame. Consciousness is the same way, because the only thing going on here is a conversation between the player and the computer. They keep passing data back and forth. And the computer then computes this picture that you look at that shows the things that the consciousness, the choices that the consciousness is making, and computes the consequences of those choices. You see? So there's really only two things that are active going on. The other is just a picture so that you get to see what's going on. The elf is not conscious. There's no way to make your elf in World of Warcraft conscious. It's just a computed character. And no matter how clever you are at computing, as long as it's computed, it can't be conscious. Now, that doesn't mean that computers can't be conscious. A computer can be conscious, but not because you program it. It's because you produce an environment in which a character has interesting choices, free will choices. Then an individuated unit of consciousness in a reality somewhere else can log on and play that computer, can play those choices, make those choices for it. You see, just like it does for us. So you don't program consciousness into a character. That is irrational. It's illogical, and that's not how it works. So that's it. So we have lots of people saying, yeah, virtual reality is a great idea, and it's our ancestors and this and that. That's materialism that just won't die. If you look at virtual reality, you see it can't be computed from inside the virtual reality, and you see that the consciousness also has to be outside the virtual reality. So ancestors are just a grab in the sky for some sort of explanation that maintains our sense of materialism. And yes, that's the common view. And that's even what's meant when they talk about the simulation hypothesis. That's what most people think when you say that. But that's not what I mean by it at all. My simulation hypothesis is a very different one. Yes, this is a simulation, but not because there are other humans, computing it. It's because consciousness is fundamental. Consciousness is the computer. Consciousness is the player. And what you see here in our bodies, we're avatars. And we avatars are just computational. So does that answer your question? Probably more than answers your question, right?
I think that's, for me, that was one of the things that really set you apart. And, when I discovered that's where you were going, it was something that was an aha moment for me. So, I think that's something we need to get out. I did see a few people chiming in about the technical parts of all this. They are on our YouTube channel. We didn't put them on the Kickstarter page now just to keep it from getting too cluttered. So go to Tom Campbell on YouTube and check that out. Vanessa, I want to grab a question from you, but I want to give John a heads up. After we get done with this next question, I want to find out how this all sort of ties into what you're doing. But Vanessa, let's grab a question from the audience.
Oh, sure. So Max Hallman has a question asking if you would consider, Tom, a collaboration with Jordan Peterson. One of his central ideas is that the purpose of humans is to mediate between order and chaos, to go into the chaos and transform it into order, which is obviously very close to your concept of love and entropy. And maybe you can speak on how love and entropy, low entropy, relate to each other, and how doing these experiments will ultimately lead us to a paradigm shift moving into love.
Okay, I'll try to make this a little quicker. Some people have the idea that you have good and evil, you have order and chaos, and those two things have to coexist in order for either one to exist. In other words, you can't have order if you don't have chaos. And I don't agree with that. You don't have to have evil because you have good. You don't have to have good because you have evil. Good and evil is created because we have free will. When you have free will, you can make good choices and you can make bad choices. And what it is we're trying to do is make good choices. That's the growing up we're trying to do. As we make better choices, then we move toward being cooperative and caring and loving and that sort of thing. And as we make bad choices, we move toward being fearful, which is self-centered and grabby and greedy and all of the negative things. So I don't think that that the two always have to coexist. Now they do coexist with us because we are generally pretty high entropy beings. We have a lot of fear. That's the way we are. And we need to change that. But eventually that ratio can change. It's not always a 50-50. There's always as much chaos as there is order. It's not a 50-50. We'd like to get it to the point that there's a whole lot more of that goodness and caring and love and a whole lot less of that self-centered fear. And that's a space we can get into. We don't need one for the other. What we want to do is, yes, convert that high entropy consciousness to a low entropy consciousness, convert that fear to love. Yes, that's what we're doing. But when we do that, there's just that much less fear in this conscious system and that much more love. So no, will we ever get rid of it to where everybody becomes love and there's nothing else to do? Very unlikely that we will get to that point. Why? Because if you don't continue to put effort in, you start to backslide. Things come apart. Second law of thermodynamics is that if you don't keep after something that's ordered, it will become disordered in time. Things just break apart. So if you think you are a being of love and you're done and don't want to play anymore, well, that's the first step you can take toward backsliding and turning into a being of ego and fear and needing to work on yourself again. So it's not one of these things that just ends where we all, get our own harp and a nice cushy cloud and sit, and play for the rest of eternity. There's always work to do. There's always other people to help. There's always a way to be part of the solution. And I don't see an end to it. So yes, there's a lot of chaos and a lot of negativity and a lot of fear in the world. And the whole point is we need to reduce that. We need to get rid of it. People need to grow up, take responsibility for themselves and their own choices and make this a better place. It doesn't have to be like this. And when we when most of us are beings of love, we will create something else bigger than us. We will have something, a thing, if you will, that is more powerful, more flexible, more everything than we are. There is this thing called collective conscious, and collective consciousness is just a natural attribute of consciousness when people get together and join their minds, and they do that whether they really think about it or not. You're a member of any group that you feel that you're a member of, you become part of that collective consciousness of that group. You affect them, they affect you. And that's how we have cultures. Culture is just collective consciousness. It's how we all agree. And we take on a lot of information out of that collective consciousness. Nobody teaches us that this is a deterministic reality. Nobody teaches us that this is a materialistic reality, but most everybody believes that. It's not that we're really trained into that. We just believe that from the very beginning because it's part of our collective consciousness, the way we think. So whether it's right or wrong, it's ours to deal with. We just need to outgrow it.
So John, how does this tie into what you've been researching all these years?
Well, it hasn't only been me, but yes, there's a lot of research that's been going on in parapsychology. I think what the overriding message that I'm hearing from Tom, and that I've seen from the Kickstarter and from the paper that I read, is we're trying to see how we can test the edges of reality, how we can find where consciousness interacts with reality. And in parapsychology, for decades, we've been working and trying to take standard materialistic science and expand it to include our experiences. So much of materialistic science is based on, well, we see this in a lab, we can repeat it over and over. But when you put people in the mix, even when you put animals in the mix, when you put any consciousness into the mix, it starts to change. And it's not so easy to predict. You don't get that p-value of 0.0001. If you get 0.03, you're doing pretty good when you get people involved. So what we're doing in parapsychology right now, and what we're doing at the Rhine, is trying to look at these experiences, trying to find the edges and push the materialistic sciences a little bit further towards accepting the role of consciousness in material world. Part of this also involves energy healing. It's one of the main research studies we're doing at the Rhine is related to people who do psychic healing or energy healing. A lot of people look at this as if it's a psychokinetic effect. There's something that someone is having a mind-matter interaction effect on another body. But when I speak to people who are energy healers, they don't talk that way. They talk about making connections with other people, about sharing space with them, providing an environment where this is able to happen. They don't talk about trying to, as if you were trying to move a pencil or move a wheel with your mind where it's intended. They talk about providing an environment where people can work together. So we're looking we have the bioenergy lab where we're looking at light as a potential source of this energy that people talk about, chi, life force energy that martial artists talk about, Kundalini energy that meditators talk about, and of course healing energy that people talk about. We're looking at ultraviolet light as a potential carrier for some of this information that is being exchanged between healers, between different people. It's an information-based system rather than a material-based system, a particle-based system. This is where we're going with some of the current work we're doing at the Rhine right now. And, Tom, when I look into your experiment in more detail, and I look at some of the things you're doing with the double slit, I got cut off for a while, so you might have mentioned, I heard you say Dean Radin and talk about his work a bit. You're familiar, I'm sure, with his work that he did with the double slit and consciousness and trying to have consciousness intervene and affect the double slit, which was published in, I think, Phys Notes, which was, it's a nice crossover from parapsychology into physics and was accepted by the physics community. I'm wondering how your experiment differs from some of Dean's work.
Well, it differs a whole lot. What Dean Radin was doing, and one of the things I should say is that what my model does is it builds a foundation of theory under the things that Dean Radin's doing and the things that you're doing. It builds a foundation of theory that says how it is people can heal. Just talking about that, it says, here's how it works. It works like this. So it builds this logical foundation underneath of it and gives an explanation according to just the same theory of consciousness, gives an explanation of how all the paranormal things work at the root, what's going on there. Well, what Dean was doing is he was using consciousness to modify future probability of the results. These results are very sensitive results. So there's lots of potential noise and changes and little things that can change that make a change in the results. And whenever you have uncertainty, you can modify the way that uncertainty works out. You know, the way that uncertainty comes together and comes up with a result. You can modify that with intent. And it's just a fundamental part of consciousness that within uncertainty of a problem, consciousness can modify the future probability of how that uncertainty plays out. So Dean was looking, you know, Dean was doing things that involved the double slit, but what he was doing really wasn't science, and I shouldn't say that, really wasn't physics in the sense it didn't have to do with the double slit so much as he was just using the double slit to set up a situation where you had uncertainty and where a person's intent could modify that uncertainty to come out in a certain way. You know, we do this all sorts of things. That's what that's the way we heal. We modify future probability. That's what the placebo effect is about. It's modifying future probability. There's a lot of things that work on that basis. It's just a fundamental aspect of consciousness that produces these results. So the experiments I'm doing are very different than that. Is they're not about a consciousness intervening and modifying future probability by changing, you know, what happens. They're just hard physics experiments. You're going to set up this physical stuff and you're going to throw your particles into it, and they're going to do whatever they do. It's nothing about a mind focused on them or not focused on them. This is just hardware interacting, and it's going to come out with a hardware result. So it's not a consciousness is meddling with it someplace. What it is it's just the way the physical world works. Now that's what scientists will pay attention to. That's how they work. That's how they think. They want an experiment that says, how does the physical world work? And that's what I'm doing with these experiments. So they're not psi experiments at all. They're just plain physics experiments. And they will do a couple of miracles, I hope. And when they do, physicists will have to say, well, I guess the world works a lot differently than we thought. And there will be no other explanation other than that this is a computed reality. So that's the big difference. They're not of the same type of experiment at all that Dean Radin was doing. You know, you can do, that's what Paralabs did. They used their intent to modify future probability where there was uncertainty. When you get random numbers, there's a little uncertainty exactly what an average is going to be. Okay, you take 1,000 random numbers between 0 and 100, and you're going to get 50, sorta. But if it's 1,000 numbers, it'll go anywhere from 49.87 to 50.02. There's some uncertainty there. So within that uncertainty, you can use your intent to change that probability. So you can make, you can make every one of them be on the high side, not by much, just a little. You can make them all come out to be 50.02. But if you do that with 10 different experiments and every one, the average is on the high side, that's equivalent to flipping a coin 10 times and having it show up heads every time in all 10. So see, even though the change is small and they faulted pair because, that change is so tiny, it doesn't matter that the change is tiny. What matters is that you can repeat that over and over again. And, it's the same kind of an experiment, is that it's an intent-based experiment. That's why healers are using their intent for healing, their intent for that person to feel well, that intent for a better future for that person without the disease. It's that intent that's the motive force. And there is no physical process by which energy gets transmitted, you see, because now we're getting the physical. We're getting something physical like photons or light to be an intermediary between intent, consciousness, and the physical body. But you don't need a physical intermediary. Intent itself modifies future probability, and the illness just heals. It just goes away, because in physical systems, there's so much uncertainty. Our biology is so complex. There's so much uncertainty there that it's just easy to modify that toward better health. That's why healing is so easy. Anybody can learn to heal with their mind. Anybody can learn a remote view. It's not like only a special few people, are born with a gift that enables them to do that. Anybody can learn to do that. All they really have to learn is to get their intellect out of the way and work, from an intuitive being level place rather than an intellectual place. And it's a simple thing to do. So yeah, it's all mind based. And remember, this matter isn't really matter, it's computation.
It's an information-based system.
Exactly.
Which is where, yes.
It's
And this is where the light is acting as a carrier for information. But this is what we're looking at now. Yeah. And Tom, we could have a long conversation because a lot of healing is not intention-based at all. This is what I'm finding in our research. But that would be a much longer broadcast, and I didn't figure we would go into that in detail.
I'm interested. I'm interested. I'd like to hear about that. Although intention is not always driven by the intellect. There's a lot of intention that just happens at the intuitive and being level that is maybe not recorded as intention, but still,
it seems to be more needs based from what we're looking at with certain types of people who are doing work. If there's a need, it seems the healing tends to happen, as opposed to the healer actually having to even know what they're healing and intending to do it.
Well, I would agree with that. Yeah, but I think I can work that through as an intentional thing, because need focuses intent. If you have a need, you have an intention. And if you like to be part of the healing process, you have an intention. So it's not something you have to actually plan to do. It's just part of what and who we are, that things like that happen. But yeah, we should talk more often and kind of share data and share stuff. I think I would enjoy that. I'd look forward to learning some things that I don't know with a conversation with you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that you come to the Monroe occasionally, and we are just down the road. I go up and see Scooter and see Joe quite often. The one other thing I wanted to mention, and I hope I'm not running too long here, is you were talking about having this straight physics experiment without having psi involved, without having a parapsychology involved at all. But from my perspective, all experiments are psi experiments.
Yeah.
Because you have an experimenter involved. And the experimenter effect, the intention of the experimenter can have an effect on the outcome. It's hard to blind yourself as the experimenter from the intention and from the experiment completely. I don't know if you're taking any steps in that area, but this is the type of thing we look at in parapsychology. Traditional scientific experiments don't even consider this role at all.
Yeah,
but we have to consider this.
Yeah, I agree. It's impossible really to separate any experiment from intention, because somebody has to do the experiment, and experiments don't do themselves. And as long as humans have to be involved in doing it, then there's going to be an intention. And it doesn't matter whose hands are on. You can go get a robot to go do the experiment, but somebody had to build the robot and program the robot and set up the experimental protocols and how the experiment's done. There's no way that you can take consciousness out of the loop. It's in the loop always and forever. Yes. And it will modify whatever these uncertainties are in the experiment. So if there's lots of places for uncertainty, then that consciousness will play a major event. One of the things, and I'm just guessing here, but one of the things that kind of struck me as maybe being in this case was back, I don't know, a decade or so ago, we had this thing about cold fusion. And there were a couple of scientists, good scientists from good institutions, who had measured something and they felt very confident about it, so confident that they made a very big announcement that they had seen cold fusion in the lab. Okay. And you don't do that when you're a scientist just because, you'd like to do it. I mean, you really have to have the goods, and you have to have done it 10 times or 100 times to convince yourself of going out on that limb to make that big of an announcement. Well, they did, and guess what? Nobody could reproduce it. My guess is that the way their experiment was set up, there was enough uncertainty in it that they created those results because of their intention, because of their, it was a mind over matter thing, if you will. Those results were real. They saw them, but it was a creation of their own. And when you just had it done in some other lab, some other place, by some other people who were very skeptical of that being done, it didn't work. So yes, I think that's probably, and I don't know for sure, but that's probably an example of what you're talking about. Where there's uncertainty, mind will affect that uncertainty, and there is no way to isolate from it. It's
I just finished a recent study where what we were looking at is whether people's moods and emotions can have effect on working computer networks. And it was a laboratory study and one of the things I was trying to do very carefully was to keep myself out of the study. Mm-hmm. And so I did all the programming, put it all together, developed the analysis software, but I did interact with each of the people who came through. None of them knew what results any of them got individually. I don't know the individual results. I kept myself out of it as much as possible. And we did find that people, when they have anxiety, when they have frustrations, they produce errors in a working computer network, in a network transmission, in the information transfer. Not by touching the machine, just their moods affect it. Unconsciously. It's an unconscious effect. And we also find this in what we call poltergeist experiments or situations where people have unusual events objects moving around them, or unusual effects on electronic devices.
Yes.
This is where some of as we start carrying more phones around with us and having more devices with us, we're going to see more and more of this as we move forward. But in the lab, having these unconscious effects on electronic devices, when you're working with so many electronic devices that are so sensitive and so carefully tuned, it's so easy to intrude on this. It's a real problem to figure out how to separate ourselves from them.
Yeah. I don't think we can separate ourselves, but we can maybe build some barriers, but get a little distance. But I don't think we can break that link altogether. I think that's hard to do. Yeah, I was talking with some not remote viewers, but people doing spoon bending, and some of them got really good at the spoon bending to where the spoons, they just hold a spoon up and the spoon would just go limp and fall over, in their hand. And then the subject came up among this group that be careful what you think on your way back home when you get in that airplane. You don't want that engine or that wing of that airplane just to droop like a spoon, and and then suddenly I could feel there was a lot of anxiety just kind of ran around in the crowd once they realized that with their intent, they could make metal act like it was liquid. They could make metal be very malleable. And when you're sitting in an airplane at 30,000 feet going 500 miles per hour, that is not a time to make any metal liquid or malleable, you see. And suddenly this anxiety just blossomed. You could feel it. Everybody's, oh my God, I never thought about that. But what about driving my car? What about this? What about that? This is, and they didn't realize that, yes, intent can do this. And you need to be some aware of what your mind's doing. But I think it all works together in a sense that as you get good at these things, you also get good at controlling your own mind and your own intentions and your own intuition, so that it doesn't come, you don't get good at this when you have no control or no sense of it, whatever. It takes some practice and some building. And by the time you build that much control, then you're not going to make your airplane wings go limp or your brakes stop working or something like that just out of the blue. It is a very precise thing. Even if you're intellectually not aware of it, it's still something that you're doing. It's still intent-based, and it is a mind over matter experiment. But yeah, I found that real amusing. I'm standing there in the crowd and somebody pointed that out and everybody kind of took a deep breath and held it for a while as they contemplated their trip home, depending on metal not bending.
Well, and you don't want your spoons to bend while you're eating a bowl of tomato soup either,
No. Well, but they don't, because it is, there's an intent-based thing here. And I've never heard of, one bending in a place where it wasn't where they were trying to bend it. So it's because it's an intent-based thing. So anyway, yeah, it's very interesting, but you can't take the mind out of the interaction, because the interaction is because people create the interaction. And if people are involved in it, then you've got a variable there that cannot be eliminated.
Speaking of intent, my intent was to get us done after about an hour, so I'm going to have to interrupt here and we'll get a move on. I have noticed some people asking about some of the technical questions. They are on the YouTube page. You can check that out. We kind of have kept them off the Kickstarter page initially just because it's getting so messy already. People are getting confused, so you can check it out, the MBTLA, and we also have some new videos that are up for that. Also, I think we're coming up on 50% funded already. So if you haven't made the donation, go ahead and do it. Want to thank John for joining us. That was a fascinating conversation. I believe the website is rhine.org. Is that correct?
Yes, Rhine, WHINE.org. And that's for the Rhine Research Center. And then we have rhineedu.org for the Rhine Education Center, where we teach courses in parapsychology online.
Okay. Well, thanks, John. Good to have you here. And we are going to be doing more of these as we go. I believe Tom is about to go into an immersive, so we're going to be off for about a week. But sign up or subscribe to right below where it says live. You can subscribe to be notified when we're going to have new ones. I think the next one's on the 24th in that vicinity, but we will keep you updated. And I'll be getting that out via Kickstarter here pretty quick. Also, check out.
I'd also like to thank John for coming. I appreciate you coming, John. It's really good to meet you. Really good to have you here. And everybody out there who's listening, if you've ever had this idea, this question that says, "Well, is this real, or is people making this up?" Go to Rhine. Go to those links. Take a look at it, and you will find. Did you tell me 8 decades? There's 8 decades worth of research in the paranormal there. It's not just something that was done the last couple of years. There's 80 years worth of data there. And some of that older work was really very seminal and very good work. So, I encourage people, go to the Rhine and look and see and read, and you will find that this indeed is science. It's not just people making stuff up, and it isn't sloppy protocols and people, fooling themselves and the rest of it. It's real stuff, and there is tons and tons of good scientific research to validate that these things exist.
Well, thank you, Tom, and it was great to meet you also, and really nice to meet you, Scott and Vanessa. Thanks so much. And yes, please, if you have a chance to go to the Rhine and see what we're doing there, we are going through a bit of a renewal. As the sciences are going through a renewal, we are following suit and trying to move forward and integrate consciousness more into the material sciences. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, and thanks to Vanessa. Check out Low Entropy Community on Facebook for Vanessa's group there. And but remember, you can submit questions when we're not live. There is a button you can use for that. Don't forget to donate, and we will be back and doing this again here in about a week. So stay tuned, and I want to thank all the people that have been watching, and we'll hopefully catch you on the next one. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.